Hi, everybody. Welcome back to day 2 of analyzing the poem A Dream Deferred, written by the poet Langston Hughes. It can sometimes be difficult to understand what a poem is meaning by reading it the first time through or even the second time through. And so in order to figure out what it means, we have to reread it multiple times to help clear up any misunderstandings that we may have, or just to come to an understanding in general. I believe after yesterday's lesson, you're probably pretty clear that Langston Hughes is asking, how do people respond to things that they realize that they maybe cannot or will not achieve in which they had originally hoped to, or why people no longer believe in their dreams, perhaps because of the choices they've made, or maybe of things outside of their influence that they aren't able to control. So bear with me, and I'm going to cast my screen and I'm going to make edits directly on the poem, and I'm going to walk you through my thinking as I make marks. And again, hopefully the more I model this for you, it will become natural for you to do. Along the way in this video, you will be having questions pop up that I would like for you to stop and answer, so to show me that you're understanding and making connections with me. All right, off we go. All right, going through the poem this first time, one thing that I really want to focus on is diction. And if you don't know what diction is, it is the choice of words used. So the word choice that Langston Hughes chose. Some people talk and talk and talk, and they can never really get to their point. Yet Langston Hughes says so much in just 11 little lines. And so let's start off by looking at the verbs. And if you don't remember what verbs are, think actions, things that people can do. Let's start with dry. And it's talking about the raisin. And if you think from our lesson yesterday, a grape is healthy, it's plump, and if it is abandoned in the sun, it shrivels up and it dries, which means it becomes, basically it's becoming little to nothing. Another verb that I want to talk about is deferred. And deferred, as we discussed yesterday, means delayed or postponed or put off until later. Another verb that I want to talk about, actually there's two, both fester and run. We talked about having a wound that gets infected and it can seep, and those are two more verbs. Another one is stink. We have crust and sugar. In those those are verbs because it's talking about the action that is happening to the donut. Sags and explode. So now that we've marked these verbs, there are connotations of words and denotations. And the easiest way that I could think to tell you is that the denotation is the dictionary definition of a word. So if you see the word stink, for example, you could look it up in the dictionary and tell the exact definition. So connotation of words can either have a positive or a negative feeling that is attached to it. So at the bottom, we have the verb explode. And explode has what I would say a negative connotation. I think of violent, I think of sudden and alarming. And so explode has a very negative connotation. The next one is sags. I think of something being droopy, it's heavy, it's being weighed down. Again, that gives me kind of a sad or heavy feeling, and therefore that also has a negative connotation. When I go up and talk about the donut being crusted or sugared over, again, typically crust and sugar isn't a bad thing, but in the way that the simile is using it, I do think that it is a negative connotation. It's getting old, it's getting a little bit stale, it's no longer as sweet as it could be. Then we have stink. He could have used the words aroma, he could have used even the simple word smell, because those have a more either neutral or positive connotation or meaning, but he chose stink. That's the same as like an odor or stench. Those words all have a very negative connotation. So I'm noticing a pattern here, but let's keep going. When we talked about the wound, he talked about fester and run. Fester is an infection forming. So in that seeping or running, again, negative connotation. Deferred, that's something that's delayed or postponed. That's not necessarily our favorite thing in the world. We can lose our patience with that. We can become frustrated when things don't go the way as we had planned. So again, negative connotation. And when the grape that was full of life and plump and it gets abandoned in the sun and dries out, it becomes little to nothing. So therefore, again, dry has a negative connotation. All right, so that leads me to tone. Tone is the overall attitude that an author is creating with their diction. Again, that's the words that they choose. The imagery, which are the visualizations that you picture in your head as you read their words, and also the details that they add. And in order to understand the attitude of the author, to make sure that we are clear and correct on the attitude of the author, we need to look over the poem and look for more figurative language, as well as some shifts that happen in there. Yesterday, we did look at similes, but let's go back to the poem and see about other types of figurative language or literary devices. All right, so we have our similes here, but in addition to that, I want to talk about imagery. And I just mentioned before that that is when an author uses specific words, their diction, their word choice, to help you visualize or imagine some sort of picture in your head. And so here, I want to mark raisin in the sun because I can definitely visualize that. I can definitely visualize the sun kind of baking the goodness or the juiciness out of that grape. I also would like to mark fester like a sore and run, because although that's not a very pleasant thing for me to visualize, I can definitely visualize that. So again, that's a use of imagery. All right, another thing that we should look at in order to fully understand an author's tone is any shifts that happen. Shifts are changes that may happen. And so poetry often has a shift where the poet comes to some sort of realization about the subject that they are writing about. So let's take a look at any shift that we have in this poet by Langston Hughes and try to think about what his purpose for that shift is. First of all, we actually have two shifts in this poem. The first shift that we have is in the length of his stanzas. So if you look, we have one short stanza, a stanza with one line, and then we have a really long stanza in the middle, and then we have a short stanza with two, and then another stanza with just one line. The second shift that I notice in the poem has to deal with the punctuation, and we always have to look at the punctuation when it comes to a poem. So I notice that the poem has question marks. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 questions, and then it goes to a statement or a suggestion or a comment, and that is a shift. That is the first time that Langston Hughes actually writes something that isn't asking the reader a question, and then it goes back to a question. In addition, I like looking at the font. I told you when you write your poetry to be creative, play with the fonts, because I think that you could use a lot of different creativity with fonts to help share the tone of your poem. And I notice in this poem, it's pretty much the same font, except if you go down to the very last line, or does it explode, when Langston Hughes published this poem, that line is actually italicized. And generally when an author puts something in bold or underlines it or has it italicized, they want that line to stand out. They want you as a reader to emphasize that line. So here, when he's saying, or does it explode, we talked about the connotation of explode is pretty violent, maybe some anger, some built up tension here. And he's also italicizing. So if you remember back to when Langston Hughes read this poem, when we heard his audio in the first video, he actually really did emphasize that last line. And that's what he would like you to do as a reader. Thinking about the tone again, when I think of the imagery and the connotation of the words that are used, and when I think of figurative language and the shifts, the overall tone that I would think that this poem has is confusion, hopelessness, pretty negative thoughts about dreams being deferred or put off. I think about disappointment. Another thing worth looking at when you are trying to analyze a poem is any patterns that you may notice. And here we've already discussed the stanzas. There is no real pattern, but one thing that I think is worth mentioning and noticing is that Langston Hughes starts with a question, but he also ends with a question. That's called a circular pattern. It came full circle. We also discussed coming full circle when we were learning about different strategies on ways to really cinch up your personal narrative at the end. So you will see different writing patterns and this circular pattern in all different types of writing. But with this specific poem, when he starts with a question, or when any poet begins with a question, you expect to have that question answered as you read the poem. I think it's really important to note that this question is never answered, just as the dream is never achieved. Throughout this poem, the speaker does list a lot of possible scenarios on what could happen, but in the end, the speaker is still questioning. Does it explode? What happens to it? And I want to know, why do you think that Langston Hughes does this at the end of his poem? Why would he leave that question open? Now that you've shared your thoughts, I want to share some of my thoughts. First of all, I think that it depends on the person. We all handle disappointment differently. We all handle frustration differently. And I think that what happens to dreams deferred depends on the person that has the dream deferred. I also think that it depends on what dream is being deferred. How important was that? How much did you want that in your life? And I think depending on different dreams in our lives that can be deferred, we may have a feeling of feeling sick when we even think about it. We may have a feeling of something exploding and it brings us anger. We may lose hope in that. Bottom line, different dreams or goals or aspirations in life will impact us differently than others, and it will impact different people different ways than others. Now let's talk about theme. When we read the novel Freak the Mighty, we had a little mini unit on theme. We learned that a theme is a complete sentence that states the lesson that the author is trying to convey through their writing. So what does the author want us to learn from their writing? There are some specific rules for theme. I've already mentioned one. It needs to be a complete sentence. You cannot say a one word such as disappointment. That is a subject or a topic, but a theme is a complete sentence. It also should not name anybody's names. It shouldn't mention anybody's names, characters in Freak the Mighty, or in this case, it shouldn't mention Langston Hughes or you or me, because a theme should apply to anybody, no matter their age, their gender, their socioeconomic status, their financial, whether they're rich or poor. It should apply to every single person, this lesson that you are getting through the writing. So in this poem, if you had to state what you thought the theme was, please state what you think that theme is. And finally, I want to go back to the title. The title is something we haven't looked at a second time. Now, in yesterday's lesson, when we looked at the title, I asked you to predict what you thought that this poem would be about just by reading the title. Now that we have analyzed and understand this poem much, much more, I want you to go back and review the title. Do we have a better understanding of the title, A Dream Deferred? Hopefully, by now, you know that the title Dream Deferred indicates that a dream that is deferred or put off can leave many unanswered questions, as well as become like a devastating burden to a person, and it really can weigh on them, and it can impact different people differently. In our very first lesson, I tried telling you that poetry is all around you, and here is one of the first examples that I'm going to show you. Nike, which I know that you all are well aware of the Nike brand, they had a commercial for their shoes, and they actually used this poem, A Dream Deferred, for their commercial. So check it out.
This has been a disappointing 2007 season for Sonia Richards. She will not qualify for the illness for much of 2007. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat or crust and sugar over like a silky sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode?
All right, we have definitely covered a lot today. I'm sure your brain is exploding like the poem, but hopefully not anger or violently, but hopefully your brain is very full with different ways to absorb a poem or to analyze a poem. And so now what I'm going to have you do is we're going to stop here and we are going to look at this poem one more time tomorrow. And I'm going to probably flip it a little bit and it's going to change your whole thinking about the poem, which is a good thing. It's going to challenge you a little bit. But in the meantime, I have in Google Classroom another template for you to write a different simile poem. And I have a template for you to write a simile poem about your family. I have posted an example, I've modeled for you a poem that I wrote about my family. And you can look at that and use that. And in my poem, I use the metaphor of a tree and I talk about the branches and the roots and the trunk and different members of my family and how they symbolize different parts of that tree. I don't want you to pick a tree for your family. I want you to pick something else. Pick any other thing or object that you could compare your family to. Again, look at my example, take it in, kind of see what I did with different figurative language or literary devices, and I want you to try to do the same. Thank you for staying tuned, and I have one more question for you. We've had some current events going on in our country that hopefully you've seen on the news, or probably seen on the news, I should say, at the Capitol building. And there are a lot of people disappointed that President Trump wasn't reelected or upset about how the election went. And I'm going to really stretch you here, but this is going to lead you into tomorrow. How does this poem, A Dream Deferred, how can we connect that to the events that happened in our world just this week? All right. And tomorrow, write what you think, but tomorrow that's what we're going to discuss. So tell me what you think and have a beautiful day.